Okay, so we will all have seen footage, of course, on TV this week, and the fallout of the fire that struck the Notre Dame in Paris. And there's been an international feeling of sorrow and mourning, really, not just confined to religious or architectural circles, but across society, I suppose. Why do you think there is such an emotional attachment to that building, but also to buildings more generally?
To answer the first question first, Notre Dame, I think, occupies a much more central place than almost any building in Britain. You know, you could name Westminster Abbey and St Paul's and Buckingham Palace and all the others, but Notre Dame is the cultural centre. I heard that all mileages are calculated from Notre Dame throughout the whole of France, and that I think is true culturally, that it's the sort of touchstone of everything. It's also very, very much identified with French history. When you think the French have always had a bit of an ambivalent relationship with religion, you know, the Revolution and other times, and of course, in good times and bad, it's been an important building. I mean, that great bell was sounding in 1944 when de Gaulle marched up the Champs-Élysées. It sounded again when Charlie Hebdo, do you remember, about 2 or 3 years ago, the terrible massacre there? And it's just so much part of the nation. But I think, in addition, as you quite rightly say, it's an international iconic building. Iconic is a word that's far too much used, but there's no doubt it applies to Notre Dame. I think in terms of architecture, and I speak as an architect, it's one of the great Gothic buildings of the world. There are many Gothic cathedrals in England and France, but that is the supreme one. It's a vast building, apparently not particularly well looked after over recent years, and I think that's been part of its history as well. And that may have been one reason why the fire took place, but it's central. And of course, to answer your second question about buildings across the world, there is a saying that a town without old buildings is like a man without a memory. I mean, they tend to last longer than the people who created them, a lot longer. And the message goes down through the generations, and people attach a great deal to them as sort of flagships, as historical reference points.
Speaking to you earlier, the building itself in this instance has seemingly been of a bit of a personal influence or inspiration or interest to you. Can you tell us a bit about why that was?
Well, if you sort of wind back to when I was a Nobberty lad, a teenager, in fact a 14, 15-year-old, we had a very inspirational art teacher who was, if you can imagine somebody that's a sort of artistic version of Captain Mannering, well, that was Wilf Colclough. And he was that really inspired quite a few of us to become architects or interested in architecture. And we had to do a great deal of drawing. And at the time, many of the great buildings of the world, and I've been to so many of them since, I drew as a 14, 15-year-old. And I actually have here my school book from the early 1960s with a drawing that I did of Notre Dame. And along with all the others, with very spidery handwriting, and I wouldn't like you to read some of the things that I wrote because it was very poor, but the drawings are not bad for somebody of my age.
If you could just hold it aloft,
yes.
And we can have a look. It's pretty ornate, really. You said to me earlier as well you were quite proud of that still, which is quite nice.
When I saw this the other day, I happened to be going around to friends to pick them up for something we were going to in the evening. I watched it on television, and I'm not ashamed to say that it really brought the tears. I was so sad to see it. One of the great things going up, one of the most beautiful things that we thought was immutable, would last forever. And I suddenly thought of the school book, and I got it out. So for the first time in 50-odd years, here it is with my tribute to Notre Dame, which, of course, I visited many years later, and was already, because I'd written and drawn so much about it, was an old friend even then.
On something of a tangent then, maybe, Do you feel there are any buildings on the Isle of Man which might carry a similar sort of sentiment or an emotional attachment with people, on a different scale, of course, but it's just, if they're sort of an equivalent here, maybe?
It is a different scale, there's no doubt about it, but I think many of us would regard as reference points some of the significant buildings. I mean, one of them that I worry about at the moment is the Castle Mona, which has had a checkered history, and of course there are the buildings that have a degree of protection. But I mean, I notice in France that all the major church buildings are under the control of the government, and what good has that done them, So sometimes you think something's safe and it's not necessarily so. I personally think there are so many. I think the Isle of Man has a heritage of buildings which is a good deal lower key, but we are so familiar with them. I mean, the wheel is one of the most extravagant things that we have. And the wheel nearly disappeared in the 1930s. The scrap men came and took almost everything else in the valley at that time. There's another building, or pair of buildings, on the Calf of Man that I often regard as architecturally the most inspiring and interesting. The two lighthouses on the Calf, which are in the ownership and the care of M&H. They are superb pieces of sort of strutting Georgian architecture, and there they are. I just hope that they don't decay too fast and they can be conserved. It's an expensive business, as we well know from Notre Dame. I mean, I don't know what the appeal, the funding is now, but it runs to many hundreds of millions of euros.
I think, as far as I'm aware, it was over 600 million euros upon my last check.
Climbing. And here we are, less than 48 hours after the disaster. It's expensive, but I couldn't help reflecting that Notre Dame Cathedral, when it was built, involved the huge sacrifice of people to create something so important and so beautiful and so spiritually stimulating, and therefore we have this duty to maintain them, even though this can be cripplingly expensive. I often think of Warsaw, which the Nazis virtually destroyed in the Second World War, and the Poles, despite all their tribulations since behind the Iron Curtain and so on, painstakingly restored the city of Warsaw, the historic places. And they were only able to do that because of the sacrifice they were prepared to do, but also, interestingly, that they, architectural students long ago, had measured every bit of Warsaw that mattered. So they were able to go back to drawings and rebuild them. And I wonder if anybody, although it cost them a great deal of money post-war to recreate historic Warsaw, I doubt whether anybody really regrets that now. And I don't think they'll regret having to sacrifice so much to rebuild Notre Dame.
Well, the feeling seems to be that Notre Dame can be largely, at least, saved, I think, despite obviously extensive damage and the pretty harrowing footage I think we saw on television. Presumably there are people specially trained in these kind of reconstruction exercises who can start to implement some of that.
Well, I mean, we've had quite a few of these disasters. I think of the Glasgow School of Art, which burnt down not once but twice. The Mackintosh building. I think of the Fenice in Venice, the Opera House, which burnt down in 1996. And there are people. Fortunately, there's been a growing profession of people who are specialist architects, surveyors, and conservationists. It's too early to say how much will have to be completely redone on Notre Dame. What they're saying at the moment is that the timber roof and the flesh spire and various things, much of which apparently was put in the early 19th century, that went. But seeing the photographs, you can see that the stone vault has been punctured in a number of places. So there's a lot still to be said. And also even the business of firefighting, the burden of all the water that's poured on the building, we don't know at this stage what that slender structure had to endure and how much it was able to withstand it. But I'm absolutely confident that there nowadays, more than ever, certainly in the last 200 or 300 years, there are people who are capable of doing the restoration.